Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, whenever you're able to tune in to this special conversation. My name is Dave Sleet, co-founder of A&A Psychological Accreditation, and I am joined by APA co-founder and CEO, Siobhan Crosby. Siobhan, thank you for taking some time to speak through the topic that we've been talking about for best part of about 4 years. And something that is truly misunderstood, is it not?
It is. It is really misunderstood, and it's important to acknowledge that actually every single person that works with somebody vulnerable has the opportunity to cut too deep for the other person's capacity in that moment. The importance of recognizing our responsibility towards the people we work with is absolutely imperative. There is always a power dynamic in a room when it comes to a client and therapist, especially in the early stages of therapy. Now, it's up to us as counselors, psychotherapists, psychologists, anybody that works in this field, to be mindful, incredibly mindful, that actually they will think and feel completely different to that client sitting in front of them that's walked in for the first time. I have rarely across 20 years met somebody that bounces in the room on their first appointment, absolutely delighted and ecstatic to sit in front of a therapist. What I've had throughout 20 years is optimism, mostly fear and anxiety of being judged. And like I said, the rare one that feels optimistic too. Now, by the end of the first appointment, and I say this because I ask absolutely everybody that's new sitting in front of me and everybody else that I carry my journey alongside them with, I asked them at the end of that first appointment how they felt in relation to the beginning of the appointment, and they acknowledge their comfortability has changed drastically in the time that we've spent together. Yeah. This is a power dynamic. It is really important that every single person recognizes there is one, because there is.
And this is where I think that a lot of the misunderstanding about power dynamics really kind of needs to be addressed, needs to be focused on in a way that isn't kind of let's scare everybody, let's, because there's no reason to be scared through having the knowledge. But it's easy for professionals in all walks of life to understand that they provide a power dynamic. But quite often we are groomed as professionals that it's our role to reduce that and take that out of the room. But it's only 50% of the equation, isn't it?
It is, because I personally see every single person that comes into therapy as courageous, decisive, taking control over their life, being motivated, being proactive. That's my perception of them wanting to change something within them that's not working for them. But that's my perception, my recognition. That's not theirs. Yeah. Their recognition of themselves is often, I'm using language that I've heard, weak, vulnerable, inadequate, stupid, irresponsible, whatever you want to put on it. They walk in with a lot of negative thinking about their own mind, but most importantly, the recognition that I've never known anyone that has not sat down and feared being judged for what they are going to share. And it's important to acknowledge that fear is there. Just because I do not feel it doesn't mean that they won't. They do.
And that fear and that kind of place in which a client brings into the room, they place the power to reduce that on the professional. Just as if, we go to a medical doctor or we go to a mechanic to fix the car, we're putting the emphasis on their knowledge, their understanding, and the power is given to them. And in the therapy room, that's exactly the same, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, a good example of that is even when I've worked with people for a while and they trust me, I have a very particular technique that I use in relation to helping them look at themselves. And that technique is role play. So I will play them and ask them if they are happy to sit in my chair. Now it's just a chair, but the impact of inviting somebody to sit in your chair in any other setting probably wouldn't even be thought about. But in the therapeutic setting, it's recognised as the control chair, it's recognised as the power chair, it's recognised as the secure chair. And sometimes, a lot of the time, most people balk at the thought of sitting in your chair. Now, with work and encouragement and, if you like, going through the journey of confidence over a period of time, someone will eventually do it. Some people will do it quicker than others. But there's always that. I've never ever sat in front of anybody unless it's a youngster. The difference between youngsters wanting to jump into your chair is completely different to an adult wanting to jump into your chair, which is really quite interesting in itself. But when I talk about power dynamics, it's not that I don't see the person as equal. I do, because when I think about their occupation, I'm thinking of, I don't know, let's just say a neurosurgeon. If I'm sitting in front of a neurosurgeon, he's come to me for help. I'm saying he in this instance. I know that there are females out there that become them too, but I'm choosing a male for this example. They come to me for help. Now, if we role reversed and you put me in an intensive care unit, I'm not going to have a clue what to do. So the power dynamic would be completely and utterly reversed. Now, just because I'm aware that there's a power dynamic doesn't mean it oughtn't to be acknowledged. And it is actually really important to acknowledge it exists, because we have the power to really traumatize somebody in front of us, or we have the power to work with them ethically and appropriately and care for them as another human being. So it's important to acknowledge we have that power. We might not want that power. We might dislike the power. We need to look at ourselves for why we would dislike that power. But the truth of the matter is, in that dynamic, we do have it. And if we don't acknowledge that, in my opinion, it's quite dangerous to ignore that power.
And I think when we've got that in the mix and we're able to adjust our responses to that environment, the client is bringing a power dynamic into the room. We might not be holding one. They will still be bringing one. It has a complete kind of underpinning factor in the way the relationship builds from that point on, doesn't it?
Absolutely. If, when I talk to clients, I help them process, but I also provide psychological education along the way to help them understand what's really happening. Now, bear in mind, what I do is I use all the evidence of my clients. So I'm not sitting there using me, if you like. I'm sitting there using their words, their language, their history, so their present, their future, where they express what their thoughts and feelings are, because I pick up on the parallels of their present in relation to their past. So I use everything that they give me. It is not about my opinions. It is not about my belief systems. It is about the clients. It's not about my words. It's about the clients. And often a client will say to me, what was it you said 5 minutes ago? In truth, in that moment, I often get caught off guard, because actually my focus is on the client's words, not mine. I've been doing this for a long time. So I am there to be empathetic to an individual. I'm there to accept them unconditionally. And I'm there to be open with them. And that is one question that I always get a bit lost on. And I honestly admit it in the moment, because I have to backtrack through my own mind to go back to what they were talking about to understand what my own response is.
Yeah.
Thankfully, that doesn't happen often. And I say that in all honesty, because my focus is so much on utilizing the answers the client brings. They have the answers. They might not know how to work out what to do with the information that they bring, but they bring all the information into the appointments. It's about them, it's for them, and it's alongside them.
Yeah. When we use the phrase the invisible scalpel, this is something that we've talked about since the conception of APA. And as it says on the screen behind me, not everyone can handle it effectively. A lot of people don't understand the invisible scalpel either, do they?
No, because they see it as, they hear invisible scalpel and they instantly do whatever it is in their head that they may not like. But the truth of the matter is, it is disresponsible. Mental health is about our minds. So when you think about the trauma that people go through and how it impacts on the mind, we have the capacity to help them navigate through what they're going through that is coming through their minds. Now, if we don't recognize, and actually I find it quite scary, if we as professionals, all of us, do not recognize the power that we have, and more importantly, or equally as importantly, the responsibility of holding that person's thoughts and feelings. We're talking about clients that sometimes will bring you their deepest, rawest pain that they've been through in their life. To abuse that, to not acknowledge that, to not hear that, I think is so irresponsible. And we have to have a responsibility in the role that we have to make sure that the way that we work with people is from a place of understanding that that one power imbalance is there. It's not our job ever to abuse that. And secondly, our responsibility is recognizing that they are placing their life in many ways in the hands of a professional.
Yeah.
What we do with that is, in my honest opinion, and this is the way that I personally work, I honor their courage to be able to share with me things that sometimes nobody else on the planet will ever get to know.
I think it's worth pointing out, this is probably one of the toughest conversations that we've had around professionals in the world of therapy.
Yes, because ultimately I'm so frightened for the world of mental health moving forward, because unfortunately I hear things where students are not necessarily being taught that actually their responsibility is a major responsibility for that person in front of them. And that confuses me, because if we're not responsible in the role that we're in, and yet we hold somebody's trauma that they give us, then the fear of what damage that person might do is scary for me.
Yeah,
and
we've seen impacts across the sector where clients who experience that sense of, or the impact of a reduction of self-awareness from the professional, and where they might not necessarily kind of abuse the power dynamic, but they may ignore, or they may not be aware that the client is bringing a power dynamic. And by ignoring that, because they're not aware of it, the client doesn't know that they're not aware of it. The client is putting all of their faith in that professional. And when that professional isn't aware of something, and therefore that can't act on that awareness, the client receives less than their natural expectation, because they've put you on that pedestal, haven't they?
They have, and it's important to recognize what that pedestal might actually represent, because the unconscious processes that take place within a therapeutic environment can be absolutely extensive. I know that and I'm saying this from not just my own perspective, from what I've been taught and what I've heard, often we will represent, speaking for me as a female, we will represent a mother figure. Now, how we respond in our tones, our voice, the way we communicate can actually echo another female in that person's history and how that female has treated them. And then you have to deal with the transference and the projections that can take place within that dynamic. If you're not aware of that and you react to that in a negative way by being defensive, then actually it can create more damage and a breach in communication. And it's so important that every single therapist, and I say this because I genuinely do believe if you want a successful private practice, but you also want to be the best of the best that you can be, it is about the academic training that you get. It is about having a brilliant supervisor by your side to guide, nurture, and support you. And it's really important to be aware of yourself in that room.
The other thing that I think is quite often overlooked, and we've seen this with the education sector quite a lot around, you know, kind of the therapeutic arena, is that the client, once they've been in the therapeutic journey, they will replicate their perception of what they've learned from that therapeutic arena, won't they?
They will, and it's, you know, it sounds quite a strange thing to say it out loud, but there's a lot of therapists that would understand exactly what I'm saying when I say this, that when somebody sits in front of you and they say, and maybe you've worked with them for a while, and they say, I was in the middle of this dynamic, Bonnie, and I heard your voice in my head, or you were sitting on my shoulder, and I remembered what you said, and I took a step back, and I thought about it, and I reflected, and actually having you there in my head. Now, for me, that will always feel a bit weird almost, but that's reflect, and not bad weird, because that's why I'm smiling, but to know that that person is carrying around the things that you've talked through in the room, and they're utilizing, it's almost like borrowing what you've said until it becomes their own. And
that is the invisible scalpel that we're passing on to those clients, because they will use that. They will support people that are in their world with the skills that have been taught to them.
And the difficulty at times, and it is important to be really aware of this, you know, people can be in their own therapeutic work, but it's important to recognize, as I do myself, and I'm not always perfect at this, but I work with this, when you're working with your own dynamics in your personal life, to remind yourself that you cannot fix what somebody else does. You have to learn to relinquish control and your desire to maybe fix somebody else, because actually all the things that you're learning in therapy are for you, the client. And one of the most important things to do is recognize that you're giving them an invisible scalpel. So one of the things that I always say to, and it really does depend on the dynamic, so it's important to point that out. If I have somebody that wants to confront them about historical trauma, I always say, I don't normally say this, but on this occasion, I'm asking you to really reflect on what you're looking to achieve by that particular dynamic, because it's important for us to explore that. Because if you go into a conversation of confrontation regarding historical trauma, and you do that to whoever it is, it's important you do it knowing what you are looking for. Because if you're going into that scenario looking for an apology, a recognition of responsibility, if you're looking for that, the chance to be disappointed and feel rejected all over again can be really quite big. So I'm conscious that they'll take out what they're learning, and often they'll go off and they'll start using that invisible scalpel that they're learning about and start opening other people up. And it has to be done in a way that is helpful to them, because otherwise they could be resetting themselves up for further trauma. So the invisible scalpel, as you say, is one of the most it's a great analogy to be able to really represent the level of power that you have. You can cut deeply at the wrong time. The intuition of a therapist with respect to knowing the person in front of them is ridiculously important. I always start my therapy appointments off building that trust up and helping that person feel as comfortable as they possibly can. If you like, following the remit of Carl Rogers in relation to congruence, empathy, and unconditional positive regard. Set the environment to a psychological basis of acceptance, and over time, an organic response begins to appear. And then I can go deeper and work and challenge people more in relation to what I'm doing. But it has to be with my awareness of picking up exactly what's happening with that person. So, for example, in the last week, somebody said to me, you never let me away with anything. And I laughed because it was said in a jokey, bantery way, because my own history created a high alert system. That high alert system means that I really don't miss a thing. I don't miss somebody taking a second to think of an answer where they're doubting themselves and thinking that I'm going to criticize them for getting it wrong. So I'll pick up on it and I'll explore. The tone of the voice dropping or creating a higher response to what we're talking about. The inability to feel the anger and deal with that anger in an appropriate way. The toes tapping, the fingers moving, which is the psychosomatic response to a feeling coming out through the body. I don't miss a thing, but everything that I do is about helping that client and giving them the power of their own knowledge about themselves, rather than me holding on to it like an invisible scalpel and not using it in a way that is about them and for them. I love this topic because it's my vocation, and educating people is so important in our world. And
it's probably worth mentioning when we look at the way therapy and the health establishment is trying to desperately kind of tick the box of, well, we've offered therapeutic intervention, but we've offered 6 sessions, and the kind of setup for failure that creates for the vast majority of clients, because 6 sessions, invariably, you're just getting to the point where the rapport is in play that you can start working with somebody.
Really depends on the context, but I totally appreciate where you're coming from, because more often that is the actual case. When I think back to my own studying and 6 sessions, if you think really logically, everything depends on what that person is bringing. So if somebody is coming with sexual trauma as part of their history, you can guarantee 6 sessions isn't going to cut it, because it can take all 6 sessions and longer for that person. And I'm thinking of somebody that's been through extreme complex post-traumatic stress. It takes time to build up that trust. 6 sessions just doesn't do it. But you've got the other side of the coin that says, and for me, I'm divided on this even with myself, because the things that I hear. You sit in front of a really great therapist for 6 appointments, that ought to absolutely encourage that person to take it further afterwards. You sit in front of a really lacking in self-awareness therapist and somebody that's not abiding by their ethics and their boundaries, that can put you off therapy for life. So from my personal perspective, it's very much about making sure that every professional, and I'll come back to it again, it's what you're in this profession for. Are you in it as somebody that is going to be creating a service and being subservient in the process of that service? Or are you going to be somebody that can be subservient without being subservient? That conflict of knowing how we serve people without being subservient.
And that's the key, isn't it? That when you understand the invisible scalpel, you understand the power dynamic that is behind that, then you can serve your client without ever being subservient. And when you have that capacity, you're able to use the invisible scalpel to the advantage of your client, but also empower them to use that skill set for themselves long term. But that takes time. That takes a huge amount of investment in an individual and their ability to build up their trust, their understanding, and their belief in the work that you're doing together, rather than the professional has all the answers and I just have to follow what they say.
Yes, and that ironically comes from my own self-awareness of my ability to be able to see everybody that sits in front of me as equal, but with the knowledge that they don't see themselves as equal to me, and working to help them be equal to themselves, because actually it's not about me, it's about them. So I love the power of therapy, and I love the power that clients gain through me responding to them as equal, despite their view that they're not. Now, obviously that changes over time, and the more comfortable that they become with you and the more trusting they become with the process. You know, the best compliment for me, and I get loads like this, which really is something that is my favorite. It's almost like, yay, they've made it. So they're not gonna, it's almost like that power dynamic is removed. When they start gently insulting me. Now, what I mean by that is when somebody says to me, Bonnie, you know, you're batshit crazy, but I like your batshit craziness. Or Bonnie, you know, you're really eccentric. Or Bonnie, you're the most different therapist I've ever worked with, or whatever it is that they say, and they're saying it from a place of authenticity and confidence in the knowledge that I'm not going to respond negatively to that in any way, shape, or form. If anything, that for me is the greatest compliment in the world, when a client has gone through a huge amount of work based on their history and then turns around and says to their own therapist, you know, you're batshit crazy. I think, yes, that's exactly.
They've now found their feet and are walking their own walk. And I think one of the things that kind of has always struck me about the world of therapeutic engagement, whether that's counseling, psychotherapy, coaching, all of the various different modes of operandi, is the role is not to keep the client, but to release them, to empower them and release them back into the wild.
If you like, yes, but with their newfound techniques and owning their own voice and relishing their own voice and using their own voice in the way that they need to do for what is good for their life.
I mean, it's that empowerment to do that, isn't it?
It is about that empowerment. It's about their belief in themselves having increased dramatically throughout the process of therapy. And it's organic if it is, if you like, if the relationship is created in the right way. It is a relationship between two people. When I hear people say, therapy is brilliant, I say, hold on a minute. Where have we gone in the middle of that therapeutic process? Because you're labeling it as therapy is brilliant, but where are we in this therapeutic process? And I know that that's an avoidance of the relationship and closeness of the relationship. So I bring somebody back to recognize it's not therapy that makes things work. It is the relationship between the therapist and the client. And I don't know one amazing professional that will sit there and say, that woman talks rubbish, because I know that all these amazing therapists have thriving private practices. Every one of them are not looking for their work through endorsements consistently online. Not saying what people do is wrong there, that's up to them. But the professionals that I work with have an organic practice that has grown over a period of time. And by God, if that doesn't say something, I don't know what does.
And on that, I just want to say a massive thank you for sharing with me the skill sets that you've developed, and for sharing with the audience out there. And I hope that the people that have been able to watch this have benefited from a greater understanding of where APA is coming from when we talk about the invisible scalpel, and the kind of future that the therapy world can achieve by focusing on the self-awareness and the relationship between client, professional and voluntary support platform. Because when those three things are balanced and are working together, all three components are in a winning situation, aren't they?
They are. So to round this up, to summarize, I would encourage every single trainee out there in particular to recognize they have power when they start working with their clients. They also absolutely ought to, and I stand by this to my dying day, avoid any course that does not encourage you going to therapy as part of that course. If you want to do the best you can by people, you absolutely have to know yourself the best you can. And that means advocating for therapy. And it's an oxymoron for me that any professional sitting in front of anybody else advocating that the clients do their work but hasn't done it on themselves, I think is actually a danger to the other person. So I recommend everybody has a brilliant supervisor that guides, nurtures and supports them, somebody that believes and wants to educate them and recognize that they do have that power, but what do they want to use that power for? The good of their vocation or the good of the client?
Thank you so much. If anyone has benefited from this conversation, then in the description on this video, you will be able to get the link to APA's CPD questionnaire. Complete that. Let us know how you've benefited and how that supports your clients, and then you receive the CPD certification. APA does not give out CPD for the sake of watching a video. Everything has to be validated. So clients know when they see a professional has got an APA CPD certificate, they've earned it. They haven't just read something, watched the video. They've actually put that into their practice. So for now, Siobhan, massive thank you. To everybody else, take care and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.